if we were focused on trying to do one thing, build one product or one feature or something like that, we could nail that, right? There's no problem, right? The challenge for Verizon comes because we're trying to do 500 things at once. We have, I think, over 300 Agile ACT teams, all working on their own backlogs with their own epics and stories and their own priorities.
Welcome to Getting to Zero, a podcast about diving into the biggest problems in product development today and how companies are trying to solve them. Our guest today is Richard Dalton, who is the head of design at Verizon. And prior to that, Richard was also the head of design at Capital One. So I'd like to welcome Richard Dalton to the podcast. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Rory. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, thank you for just very recently speaking at UX USA as well. So it's good to catch up again, although virtually this time.
Yeah, no, that conference was a blast. I really enjoyed it.
Excellent. So I'm going to jump right in. And how we run this podcast is we always start with the same question. What is the biggest challenge that you face in product development? And that's going the whole way from the initial idea to build something right up until you've got satisfied customers.
Yeah, we've recently been, as from my talk at UXDX, focusing a lot on our process and our ways of working at Verizon. And I think a couple of us were having a conversation 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we had somewhat of an epiphany, which is that if we were focused on trying to do one thing, build one product or one feature or something like that, we could nail that, right? There's no problem, right? We obviously there's challenges along the way in collaboration and speed and all that kind of stuff, but doing one thing would be fairly easy from ideation to execution. The challenge for Verizon comes because we're trying to do 500 things at once. We have, I think, over 300 Agile ACT teams, all working on their own backlogs with their own epics and stories and their own priorities. We have a very, really broad ecosystem of touchpoints and channels and capabilities and products that we're working on. And we try and launch dozens and dozens of either new products or new features every year. Coordinating and orchestrating that, I won't call it a mess, but it can feel that way sometimes, right? All that effort of thousands of people is really, I think, our biggest issue. I've recently taken to using possibly a bit of a silly metaphor, but if you imagine 300 jam jars, right, filled with water, and those 300 jam jars represent our 300 Agile ACT teams, and the water in the jam jars represents the stories and the epics and the backlogs that they put in there, some of it to improve their own capability, some of it to launch other products. And then if you say, hey, now in next quarter, we want to launch a new product, and we figure out that to launch that new product, we need to now add water to 42 of those 300 jam jars, some of them spill over, right? Because they're already too full. And we don't really have a system at the moment from a portfolio management perspective to be able to scenario plan that or to model that and say, if you're going to add some water to those 42 jars, this is what you need to take out of some of those jars, or this is how you need to increase the capacity of some of those jars to handle, maybe move some capacity from a jar that's being underutilized to a jar that's been overutilized so that it's not overflowing, or this is what you need to scale back on. And now imagine it's not just one project that's adding water next quarter to 42 jam jars, it's dozens of projects. Again, we have recognized that we are in need of a kind of strategic enterprise portfolio management system and set of workflows. And that is, I think, at the root of a lot of our challenges when you're dealing with not just one product, hundreds and hundreds.
Brilliant. I guess it's quite specific to the very large enterprise projects, but it does seem like a problem. And what are you using today? Are you using any kind of frameworks, any kind of coordination planning or anything to try tackle that problem today?
I think we're tending to use homegrown frameworks, homegrown taxonomies to understand the different jam jars, homegrown Google Sheets or Excel sheets to try and analyze this. we're now seriously starting to think about, okay, we need to invest in a more robust industry solution. And we're talking to a few vendors along those lines. But I think we've managed so far over the past 5, 10, 15 years in terms of this, as we've scaled our digital, in particular, operations and development. We've managed to get by because we have super, super talented teams and super, super talented people who can make it work. I think, and I'm not quite sure what the reason, but feels like we've reached a tipping point now where not having this is not only not helping us improve the way that we're working, but not having this is now at the point where if we don't have it, things are going to get worse, right? So I feel like we've reached that moment. I'm not sure whether that's just the scale of what we're doing or the maturity or our own increased expectations for how good we all can work, how well we can all work together. But it's now become, I think, a must-solve issue.
And when you say we, who is feeling kind of the pain of this? Who are you referring to when you say we?
I think everybody. That's actually part of some of the conversations one of my operations leader partners and I were having. It's like this is not just the design team or the product team that is feeling this pain. This is, I think, everybody in the organization, right? The engineering teams, our capabilities teams, our leaders, right? Our prioritization teams, our finance teams who have to try and figure out the funding for all of these different 300 jam jars. This is one of those things that truly should be or should improve the life of everybody in the organization. And that honestly, everybody should contribute towards putting in place and ultimately paying for, right? So that's part of the conversation now. But I think that it is early days, but I think that what we're likely to do is maybe explore that question ourselves a little bit more deeply and put in place some benefits to different roles within the organization and almost design that out, like storyboard. This is the life of this is how the life of a designer would get better with this system and these routines in place. This is how the life of a product manager would get better. This is how the life of an engineering leader. This is how the life of a finance person. This is an operations person, even a lawyer or a legal person, right? This is how their daily life would get better with this system in place, because that's essentially what we're going to have to do to make the case for investment of a few $1 million worth of spend.
You're putting together your product vision for your new...
Exactly. Right.
And are you leading the charge, or is this something, as you've said a few times, that it's just from conversations that have been going about? So is something else leading this charge? Are you leading the charge?
No, I'm not leading the charge. I'm in the second row of the cavalry, I guess, maybe, if we use that analogy. Theoden, if we're going to the Lord of the Rings metaphor, leading the charge would be one of my colleagues who's our customer experience operational leader. So within the CXO, the customer experience office, we have a operations and chief of staff team that do many things in the organization. One of which is they are leading the way with these way of working conversations and on our process, right? And this colleague of mine, Adam, is the one who is spearheading this enterprise portfolio management conversation.
And I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here. Is this a problem that just a senior leadership and it's just kind of a pet project to make your lives easier because you're the one who's having to juggle all of those jam jars? Or is there actually a business impact that you're seeing because of this inability to keep control of things?
Yeah, no, there's massive business impact. It only takes a minute of talking to one of the Agile product owner leads on one of our teams, for example, to see the pain that they feel because we don't have this, right? So they will commonly say, my jam jar is at 100% capacity, and last week I got 7 people coming to me saying, hey, next month I need you to do this. And the Agile product owner, are now in the position of having to decide which things are the highest priority or the least priority, or what I can or cannot do, which for some things within my own scope are fine for me to make those decisions on. But for these bigger, broader product initiatives that are more company or enterprise-wide, I can't now say, well, that's a lower priority. I am going to derail this product launch because I am not going to prioritize that work within my jam jar, even though the other 41 jam jars might be prioritizing that work, right? It puts the product owner and all of the associated roles within that Agile team into an unenviable position of having to either do a tremendous amount of work to understand across all of the other teams how people are prioritizing things so that I can prioritize things the same. But that work is on me to figure out how to do. We have to go and talk to the other 41 jam jar owners and say, hey, are you prioritizing that highly? If so, I should too. And then we could, or things don't get done, right? A release doesn't get done, or it drags on, right? Or the work will be unevenly distributed. We will have a whole bunch of teams do the work because it can fit in their jam jars, but then a few teams won't be able to do the work until later, which then delays the release of the product, right? Which is not great from a market perspective. So both from a business objective perspective of speed to market and efficiency, and an amount of overhead that our employees and team members are having to go through because we don't have this coordination mechanism or this workflow is pretty extreme, I think. I actually believe, and these are some of my conversations with Adam, that the efficiency gains alone of putting this in place will probably pay for it in a week. If we have thousands of people, a pretty substantial budget running to hundreds of millions of dollars when you think about all the development we do. If we can get a 2% efficiency increase, and I actually think it's going to be like 10 or 20%, but even a 2% increase would pay for this software and this rollout very quickly.
Great. So I'd like to dig into now the solution, because you've mentioned kind of software and some things. What are you thinking is your current approach to solving this problem?
And this was Adam and I's conversation a couple of weeks ago. It's like, this cannot be a new problem for organizations of our size to solve. We would never expect to run the finances and the books of the company in Excel. You would never expect to manage tens of thousands of call center employees and all of their time and their forced to load scheduling in Excel, right? So why are we expecting to manage hundreds of $millions worth of development effort in Excel, right? There are software providers out there, whether it's ServiceNow or PlanView or the other names escape me, but other providers of this kind of enterprise portfolio management, which allows teams to keep track of their backlog at a team level, which then aggregates and rolls all of that up at the macro level to allow that kind of scenario planning and modeling, right? And actually, this is a perfect thing for AI to help us with, right? If you have all the underlying information about what the teams are working on, and you have all the information about what you're trying to achieve from a product release or feature release at the macro level perspective, and you understand the relative priorities, then when you add something that adds water to the 42 of the 300 jam jars and they overflow, you should then be able to ask the system, give me a solution, right? Show me, if you've seen movies with submarine movies, right, where they're plotting a torpedo launch against, so they say, the computer's going to give me a firing solution, right? Which basically means how fast and how far away and what angle you launch the torpedo and all that kind of stuff. Like, we should be able to ask the portfolio management software to give me a firing solution here, right? Give me a solution that can get this thing done in this time. What needs to come out of the portfolio, or how do I need to redistribute resources? Show me 2 or 3 different solutions and the impacts of those. And then leadership can say, yes, make that one happen, right? And then that should put out all the change orders to say, hey, team number 27, deprioritize these things. Team number 48, prioritize those things. Team number 17, you're going to move some resources for the next quarter to team number 87 so that so we're changing the size of the jam. What is the solution there? And so, yeah, these solutions exist. We've had a couple of demos from different providers, and although that they were demos, and I'm sure that the providers of the software were showing their best cases, and they were putting their best foot forward, I was particularly impressed. I was like, wow, yeah, like this is what we need, right? So, yeah.
Brilliant. And did you look at, so I guess this is one avenue for solving the problem that you've described, is put in place some software. And as you said, particularly, it's a great use case for AI. Look at all these complex variables and try figure it out. Did you look at any other potential solutions to this problem, or did you decide that this was the right way to go?
I stress that it's not just necessarily looking at this as a software. We've been having these conversations about prioritization and capacity management and finding ways to provide our Agile teams with autonomy and agency to manage their own backlogs and portfolios at the same time as helping them understand what their kind of enterprise responsibilities are in terms of broader product launches or needs. So this conversation about how to do the workflow has been going for a while. The realization a few weeks ago was, oh, okay, in order to actually adopt the workflow that we know we need to do and provide these teams with both the autonomy and the connectedness to the broad, we are actually missing information, and we're missing routines, and we're missing an underlying system to enable them to do that, because we just can't do that in big room planning sessions or sticky notes or Excel or whatever. Like, there's a fundamental software layer missing. So it wasn't that the software idea came first. It was really hey, there's a process and a way of working that we want to adopt. What do we need to do in order to adopt that? Oh, this piece of software is a big piece of that. And it is going to change the way that people work. It's going to introduce new routines, and some of that might be more of an investment for teams, right? That we'll have to start tracking backlogs and decide whether or not how do we use Jira? So how do we encapsulate Jira or integrate Jira into this? A lot of these enterprise portfolio management systems are obviously aware of the ecosystems that they live within, so they integrate very well with different other software suites that we're using to manage work. But yeah, I see it as kind of a true PPTI, right? People, process, technology, information kind of solution to the enterprise problem we're facing here. And obviously what I've been talking a lot about is the technology aspect of it, but that people, process, and information aspect as well is pretty critical. There'll be a lot of change management.
Yeah. No, it sounds like it's going to be a challenging rollout, but I'm really interested in what triggered now. This problem, it doesn't sound like it's something new. It sounds like it's something that you've been living with for quite some time. So what was the straw that broke the camel's back, or what was the thing that decided, listen, now is a good time to solve this?
I've been thinking about that and trying to put my finger on it. I don't have a definitive answer. I do have one hypothesis, which is that our own expectations for the quality of the customer experience have risen, as all companies have, over the past 10, 15, even 5 or 2 or 3 years. We're constantly trying to get better. We're constantly trying to improve the way that our apps and websites serve both our customers and our employees, because my team and all of our CX teams focus on not just the external experience, but the internal employee experience as well. And as we increase our own expectations for the quality, I think we need to pay more attention to it. And that in some ways requires more coordination, right? I was just talking to a team before this meeting about one of our upcoming product launches, and we were looking at some of the externally facing .com web screens, and we were talking about some of the language that we were using on one of those screens. And we were saying, oh, we want to change that language. We're not too far away from launch for this particular product. We're like, oh, we want to change that language because it's not truly representing what we're trying to say. We're like, okay, this project could go in and change it, but that same product is being launched on some of in our retail. It's not just a digital only product, right? It's going to be sold in our retail stores as well, and on these large tablets that people, both employees and associates, employees and customers, can interact with in the stores. And we want that language to be consistent, right? If it says word A over here, we want it to say word A over here. And so that would now require the team and the Scrum team, the Agile team that's responsible for this over here to go in and make changes as well. That needs to be obviously coordinated. In the past, maybe we wouldn't have been quite as picky about the words being the same. And I'm using a fairly, not trivial, but a fairly simple example there. But you could equally say the same thing about functionality as well, right? The way that we do something on the web, the way that we do something in the store, the way that we do something for the associates on the phone or elsewhere should be coherent. And in the past, we allowed more compartmentalization, more siloing potentially. And I think as we've broken down those walls and as we've had higher expectations for how the experience is coherent, this need has become highlighted more and more, right? And now we're in a position where we can't achieve what we want to achieve from an experience quality perspective without this type of these routines and this process and this workflow and this system in place. There's probably other factors there. It's probably not one reason why we've got to this tipping point. I mentioned efficiency. That's probably another one as well, right?
Is there any pressure coming down in terms of, particularly with the point on efficiency, that you need to be delivering more or anything like that?
No new pressure, but what enterprise doesn't have constant pressure about how can we do more with the same, right? Or how can we do the same with less? So there's always that eye on, are we being as efficient as possible? I don't know that there's any more than any other time at the moment at Verizon, but that is always something that is forefront in our minds, right? How can we do the most with the least, right?
I'd like to dig into one of the points that you just mentioned there, which is the example, because I've seen that in a lot of companies where you have system A and system B, but they're delivering the same thing. So it could be web and mobile is a very common example in a lot of organizations. And you mentioned earlier that you spent a lot of time looking at kind of the autonomy and empowerment of teams. So can you talk a little bit about how you decided to slice up your teams? Because that's that kind of, did you slice by technology? Did you slice by customer journey? What was your approach to deciding this team owns this bit, this team owns another?
Yeah, so there's probably no one schema that applies across the entire portfolio, but I can talk about it from a not quite philosophical, but philosophy perspective or approach perspective, which is my own bias is always to try and, as the design leader, my own bias is always to try and think about use a human-centric way of thinking about the division of teams or the categorization. The taxonomy that I showed at UXDX, for example, we put that together trying to base it upon how people, whether they're customers or employees, interact with with Verizon, right, with all of our touch points. And so that one dimension is tasks that people are doing, are they contextually clustered together, right? If these are all learning about our product type interactions that people are having with us, then they feel like they should all kind of be grouped together, right? All of the buying thing, all of the onboarding or fulfillment type delivery things, all of the manage the thing once I have it or resolve a problem, right? I think I may mention this LB GUPS metaphor we have: learn, buy, get, use, pay, service, right? LB GUPS. And so one dimension is very much how people experience the products or the features. That being said, we also know that there's a kind of a channel aspect to it as well, right? Digital versus our phone associate support is called care. So digital versus care versus retail in the stores, right? So there's a channel dimension as well, right? Can we group all of those? I have a head of design for retail, for example. She deals with all of the things within our store ecosystem, because again, that's contextually relevant. Like when somebody's standing in the middle of a store, that's their world at that moment, right? We also have capabilities teams, which tend to focus more on the kind of Verizon centric perspective of things. Like we're going to build one authentication capability that's going to show up across all those different customer moments and in those different channels, for example, or we built one personalization engine or one content management system. Or so from an underlying capability perspective, we think about things that way as well. So it tends to not be a single way of arranging the teams, but we do try and map to the way that it shows up to a human being, customer or employee. And I talked a little bit at UXDX about the idea of customer activities, which is our latest attempt to really dial up the degree of customer centricity amongst the teams, right? Like everything should be able to be connected to what we're calling a customer activity, which is this thing that somebody wakes up in the morning, right, and says, oh, I'm going to do X with Verizon today. I am going to get the new phone with Verizon today, or I'm going to pay my Verizon bill today, or I am going to replace my cracked screen with Verizon today. Everything should be able to be tied, whether it's an underlying system or a capability, whether it's a retail interaction or a phone interaction, should be able to be tied to one of these sets of customer activities.
That kind of customer first structuring of teams. The benefit of that is that the theory that the 42 jam jars, you don't need as many, because to do any interaction that a customer cares about, you have one team who owns that. So have you seen less of your initiatives needing those 42, or do you still see that you're needing your 42 jam jars?
Now, I think in an enterprise the size of Verizon, with the degree of reuse that we see across our touchpoints, I think we still need a lot of those jam jars. We tend not to say, oh, we have a jam jar that's focused on the buying process, and that jam jar will design and code all of the screens, for example, that somebody needs to go through when they're getting the new phone. Because a lot of those screens that they would code are the same screens that somebody would use if they're upgrading their phone, as opposed to buying something new or trading in or getting support. So there's so much matrixed reuse across our ecosystem, and we support such a wide variety of different activities and tasks with multiple products involved, that allowing teams to be aligned purely on the customer activity, if you will, would create so much stepping on each other's toes, or so much inefficiency, right, or duplication, right, that it would really cause us to struggle. And I think this is why we've gotten to the point where we need a portfolio management system, which is, back in the day, we took that approach. So a great example of that, right, at the macro level, is Verizon used to be two separate companies, right? Verizon Wireless for mobile and Verizon Wireline, right, for Fios, right, and wired connectivity in your homes. And when I first joined the company almost 5 years ago, we had two websites, right? It was Verizon.com, VerizonWireless.com, right? And it was two separate homepages, two separate logon systems, two separate record-keeping systems, two separate order flows, two separate purchase carts, two separate everything, because it grew up that way. Shortly after joining, we were like, this is crazy, right? In fact, the business used to be organized that way. It used to be wireless and wireline, both of which served both a consumer and a business audience. Prior to me joining, we said, that's not right. We should just be one Verizon, and we should segment ourselves and have one division serve the B2B audience and one division serve the consumer audience. And within each of those, they can offer mobile and home or mobile and wired services, right? And so we merged the sites, and we're still doing it to some degree in some of the deeper levels of capabilities, right? It's still noticeable if you're both a Fios and a mobile customer, as I am. You can still see some of those cracks, right, between the systems. But prior to that, we did have a set of teams, a set of jam jars working in the wired space, a set of jam jars working in the mobile space, and it was a simpler world, right? Because they were very independent, they could do their own thing. You bring it together because we don't want to provide a disjointed experience, right, for joint customers such as myself, and you increase the complexity, and now we have to coordinate more, and now we have the need for this enterprise portfolio management system.
Brilliant. No, it's a great explanation. I guess there are the challenges as you scale up, you get the diseconomies scale as well as the economies.
I've never heard that phrase, but you're totally right. Yeah.
Back to, the capability management system. Did you look at something else? So, for example, a framework like SAFe would advocate that you can solve this with PI planning or product increment planning. So you get everybody together and you do a big quarterly plan, and that's how you solve your dependencies and all of these kind of problems. Did you look at a solution like that?
But to some degree, we use SAFe, and we have big room planning, quarterly or monthly, where we get everybody in a room and do these things. It just doesn't seem to scale to the scale that we're at and the complexity we're at, the amount of stuff we do and the amount of, you can have those conversations in the room, but without actually then having a system to capture the decisions that are made. And I'm not saying that the system would mean we wouldn't have to get together and do those things, right? You do both, right? You get together and talk about all this, and then you would put it into kind of like the record keeping system. And that would be the thing that you use on a daily basis to make sure you're executing what you've decided in the big room planning sessions, and would feed into the big room planning sessions and make them a lot more efficient, most likely, because you'd be coming in not to actually do the analysis, but you'd be coming in to look at some solutions that the system has proposed, right? Or tweak things or make sure everybody's on the same page and level set. So I think it's a question of doing both. The portfolio management system would really just be provide the ability to follow through on what happens during those big room planning sessions.
I guess in my head, I'm imagining this like in my past life of project management, a big Microsoft project with all of my different connections and interdependencies. Because the biggest challenge I had when managing a portfolio of projects was not the initial planning. Everything's great when you walk out of your room and everything's kind of perfect. But then day one, something slips or something happens or something comes in unexpected, a parachute. And that was always the impossible thing to handle, because that then meant that we had to replan everything because everything got disjointed and moved around. So is that something that you're actively looking at solving with this, and how does it solve that?
Yeah, it's exactly that. I think that, what's that phrase? No plan survives first contact with the enemy kind of thing, no battle plan. It feels like the second we have a plan, a second later it's out of date or something's happening to it, right? Because when you've got so much happening in the ecosystem, it only takes one initiative to discover something that really was a bit unexpected to then have these knock-on ripple effects, right, across the entire portfolio. Or it only takes one business unit to say, hey, we got this new idea that we need, that's urgent that we do, right? Either from a new product or feature, or we have regulatory things that are coming in or passing new laws that require us to do things. Like there's a lot of change in our ecosystem. Some of it inflicted upon ourselves or initiated by ourselves, some of it by external parties. And you're totally right. One change has massive ripple effects, and we can't get together in big room planning every day. So like, we need a system to be able to understand those implications, react to them, and give our leadership choices of being able to say, okay, this week, these are the changes that we've identified within the portfolio. These are the implications. These are the three options we have to adjust the prioritization of the portfolio to accommodate those things, right? We can say no to those things, which is easy. The portfolio keeps going the way it does. But if we say yes to any of them, this is what else needs to change within the portfolio. So adapting to change, I think, is almost the biggest requirement or benefit of the system.
Brilliant. I'm going to just jump now towards the end of looking at you've made this decision. What are the fears that you have around, what are your kind of concerns in purchasing this one? Because as you said, you're weighing up different vendors and different options. So what's the biggest kind of risk for you?
There's going to be some change with the ways that we need to work by hundreds or thousands of people who have a responsibility to deliver the existing work. So finding a way to introduce this, where everybody can see benefits to themselves. Like this needs to be done within the organization so that people are like, we're not doing this quickly enough. And I don't mean leadership saying we're not doing this quickly enough. Everybody on the ground who's going to be impacted by this work saying, wow, the benefits of the system are such that I will put more effort into, and I will do everything in my power to get this implemented because I see the benefit to myself as a product manager, designer, engineer, or whatever role, right? We almost want people lining up outside the Apple store, right, if you will, for the new device. We want that type of engagement here. If this is perceived as by our teams on the ground as something that management is implementing that's not going to have any benefit to myself, and it's just going to be another thing for me to do, as well as all of the stuff, all the real work that I'm having to do, this is not going to work at all. It's going to fail. I don't think, from the early conversations, I don't think we're going to be in that situation, but I think it's something we have to actively create a culture of or integrate into our culture and actively manage the rollout of, and from a perception perspective, and involve everybody. But that's probably my concern around how to actually roll this out without disrupting the portfolio of work too much. There might have to be some kind of short-term dip, right, in productivity in order for us to way exceed that peak on an ongoing basis. But how to make that an acceptable dip is the concern.
And it reminds me when, as you were describing it, that kind of prioritization and let's choose something and drop something else, because you have to make those hard calls between, if you want to do something, something else has to give. When I worked in a company that is probably the most business agile, they had no concept of sunk cost fallacy. So they were constantly changing. It's definitely a personality thing. Some people loved it because it's okay, let's drop that and move on to what's more important. But some people hated it. And I guess that's the challenge, because it's your baby. It's the one that you've been working on that suddenly gets deprioritized. So it's just something that I don't know if there's an answer to it. But some people love it and some people less.
And the comedy of this one, of course, as well, is that implementing this kind of enterprise portfolio management system is going to change the level of the water in the jam jar. It is itself a product that we are trying to integrate, but we don't yet have the product to help us manage the impact of that, right? So it's this self-referential kind of thing. If we had the system in place, it would be a lot easier for us to implement something like this. But of course, that's exactly why we're implementing it in the first place. We just have to figure out a way to get this one done without it. And then every future thing that we need to integrate, whether it's a change in the way of working or whether it's products that we're delivering for customers and employees, it should be a lot more smooth and efficient and high quality.
Excellent. I think we covered quite a bit there in that topic. I thought it was a really interesting topic about the challenges. I guess it's probably one that I wouldn't actually say it needs to be the Verizon scale. I've worked in companies which are much smaller but have 100. They had 96 projects in flight, and it was challenging trying to keep track of them all.
And I think this tends to be one of those things. I suspect this is one of those things that the earlier you introduce it, the more benefit you get and the easier it is to scale. So we managed to get to a point where we've got this massive ecosystem before we're like, hey, we really need to do this. I think if you implement this earlier, then you get more bang for your buck, I would suspect.
Excellent. I look forward to checking in a year's time and see how successful the rollout has been.
Me too. I'd love to.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Richard, for sharing your insights about your biggest challenge in product development, which is around, to summarize it, it's the coordination of multiple different initiatives that are running in parallel, and that leads to a prioritization challenge as well as a coordination challenge. So you're trying to juggle both the prioritization of where to work and then coordinate the people to get the work done.
In a very integrated and matrixed environment, correct?
Brilliant. It sounds like an interesting challenge, so you've got your work cut out for you.
This has been fun.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining.
If you'd like to know more about the ways you can remove the blocking dependencies from your processes, check out zeroblockers.com or follow us on your favorite social platforms.